The deafening roar of aircraft engines shattered the midnight silence over the Bay of Biscay. Lieutenant Commander Ulrich Ostermann of U-624 clutched the guardrail of his submarine's conning tower, squinting upward into the inky darkness. His knuckles whitened as the radar operator below shouted up the detection of an approaching aircraft. There was no time. The coded transmission to Berlin about the Allied convoy he had been shadowing was only halfway complete. 80 miles off the coast of Ireland on February 7, 1943, Ostermann faced an impossible choice. Dive immediately, abandoning the critical intelligence that High Command desperately needed, or remain on the surface to complete the transmission that would bring a wolf pack to hunt. He chose the transmission. "Continue vos Beictios." He barked down the hatch, his voice steady despite the growing thunder of engines. The radio operator's fingers flew across the Enigma machine keys, encoding the convoy's position, speed, and estimated cargo tonnage. The submarine's powerful transmitter pulsed its staccato message toward Berlin. Seconds felt like hours. Then, with horrifying clarity, the massive silhouette of a Royal Air Force Fortress bomber burst through a gap in the low clouds, its 4 engines howling as it dove toward the exposed submarine. Sunlight had been replaced by searchlights, but the effect was the same. The hunter had found its prey. "Dive! Dive!" Ostermann screamed, lunging for the hatch, but the bomber was already releasing its deadly payload. 7 depth charges plummeted toward the frantically maneuvering U-boat. No one in the 22nd U-boat flotilla knew that one commander's desperate gamble that night would rewrite the rules of submarine warfare forever, challenging the fundamental assumption that had driven Admiral Dönitz's strategy since the war began, that a U-boat captain's most valuable weapon was his ability to communicate. Lieutenant Commander Ulrich Ostermann had grown up in the small coastal town of Kiel, where the sea was not just a presence, but a promise. Born in 1914, just months before the outbreak of the First World War, his earliest memories were of his father's absence, a naval officer serving in the Kaiser's fleet. When his father returned after Germany's defeat, young Ulrich absorbed the bitter stories of humiliation and the stripping of German naval power. The Treaty of Versailles had gutted the once proud Imperial Navy, limiting it to just 15,000 men and forbidding submarines entirely. The family home overlooked the shipyards, and young Ulrich would watch with fascination as vessels were constructed and launched. His bedroom walls were covered with sketches of warships and submarines, drawn with the precision and detail that would later serve him well at Naval Academy. Despite his mother's hope that he would pursue a career in medicine like her father, the sea had already claimed him. At 16, he joined the Merchant Marine, gaining valuable experience in navigation and seamanship aboard cargo vessels that plied the Baltic and North Sea routes. Those early voyages hardened him physically and mentally, teaching him to function on little sleep and to make decisions under pressure. Fellow crewmen recalled a serious young man who rarely joined in their shore leave revelries, preferring instead to study naval engineering manuals or practice celestial navigation. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the quiet rearmament of Germany began, including the clandestine development of a new submarine fleet in violation of treaty restrictions. Ostermann, then 21, was among the first young officers recruited into what would become the Kriegsmarine. His instructors noted his exceptional aptitude for mathematics and technical systems. Shows remarkable spatial awareness and calm under simulated crisis conditions. Read 1 evaluation. Recommended for submarine service. Training was conducted in secret facilities in Finland and Spain, far from prying eyes. Ostermann excelled in the punishing regimen, particularly in torpedo attack calculations and crash dive procedures. By 1938, he was serving as first watch officer aboard one of Germany's first new Type 7 U-boats. During the Spanish Civil War, he gained actual combat experience, while nominally on training exercises helping to enforce the naval blockade of Republican ports. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Osterman was already a seasoned submariner. His first 3 war patrols as first officer aboard U-48 yielded 8 merchant vessel sinkings, earning him the Iron Cross Second Class and the attention of Admiral Dönitz. By 1941, he had earned his own command, taking the helm of the newly commissioned U-624, a Type 7C submarine, the backbone of the German underwater fleet. Fellow officers described him as methodical and unfailingly precise. Unlike the more flamboyant U-boat aces who cultivated larger-than-life personas, Osterman ran a disciplined boat with minimal unnecessary radio communication, a trait that made what happened on that fateful February night all the more ironic. His crew respected him for his technical proficiency and his fairness. He demanded excellence, but never asked for sacrifices he wouldn't make himself. His letters home to his wife Elsa and their 2 young children betrayed little of the growing strain of command. "The men perform admirably," he wrote in December 1942. "We are the silent service for good reason, but know that what we do today ensures Germany will never again suffer the humiliations of Versailles." After his 3rd successful patrol, which sank 3 merchantmen off the coast of Nova Scotia, Osterman was awarded the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest decoration, for battlefield valor. The award ceremony photograph shows a thin-faced man with intense eyes, seemingly uncomfortable with the attention. He quickly returned to sea, where he felt most at home. By early 1943, he had been given a special assignment to gather intelligence on the increasing effectiveness of Allied convoy protection, particularly the new radar systems that were making surface attacks increasingly dangerous. Little did he know that his final patrol would provide the Allies with crucial intelligence about U-boat communication methods that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Atlantic. As the frigid winter of 1943 gripped the northern Atlantic, the strategic situation was changing in ways neither side fully comprehended. The Battle of the Atlantic had entered its most critical phase, a desperate struggle that would determine whether Britain could continue the fight against Nazi Germany or be starved into submission. The North Atlantic convoy routes had become a chessboard of deadly complexity. Allied merchant vessels laden with food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials from North America sailed in protective formations, their routes carefully plotted to avoid known U-boat concentrations. Escorting them were destroyers and corvettes equipped with increasingly sophisticated detection equipment, forming a protective screen against lurking submarines. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, had developed his infamous Wolfpack tactics to counter the convoy system. Rather than attacking individually, U-boats would spread out across likely convoy routes. When one submarine located a target, it would shadow the convoy while broadcasting its position to headquarters in Berlin, which would then direct other nearby submarines to converge for a coordinated night attack. This strategy relied absolutely on radio communication, a vulnerability the Germans believed was mitigated by their supposedly unbreakable Enigma encryption system and their short transmission protocols called Kurzsignale that compressed complex messages into brief bursts of code. What they didn't realize was that Allied direction-finding technology had advanced to the point where even these brief transmissions could be detected and located with frightening accuracy. By February 1943, the tactical advantage was beginning to shift. The introduction of centimetric radar allowed Allied aircraft to detect surfaced submarines at night and in poor weather. The Lee Light, a powerful searchlight fitted to patrol bombers, could illuminate submarines caught on the surface, giving them no chance to dive before being attacked. And most crucially, Allied code breakers at Bletchley Park had cracked the naval Enigma codes, allowing convoy routes to be planned with knowledge of U-boat positions. The numbers told the story. In January 1942, U-boats had sunk 62 Allied ships, while losing only 2 of their own. By February 1943, that ratio was shifting dramatically. U-boat losses were climbing steeply, with 19 submarines lost in that month alone, the highest monthly total of the war to that point. On the Allied side, on the RAF Coastal Command had evolved from an overlooked and underfunded branch, often called the Cinderella Service, into a deadly submarine hunting force. Equipped with long-range aircraft like the American-built B-17 Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers, Coastal Command could now patrol far into the Atlantic, closing the infamous air gap where U-boats had previously operated with impunity. The squadron that would encounter Osterman's U-624, No. 220 Squadron, operated from Ballykelly in Northern Ireland. It had been specially trained in anti-submarine warfare, its crews skilled in the complex coordination required to spot, track, and attack the elusive underwater predators. Their Fortress bombers carried up to 7 depth charges, capable of cracking a submarine's pressure hull if dropped with precision. Meanwhile, scientific advances were turning the tide. The ASV Mark III radar operated on a wavelength the Germans couldn't detect with their METOX warning receivers, meaning U-boats often had no warning of approaching aircraft until it was too late. Sonobuoys, listening devices dropped into the ocean, could detect underwater movement, further reducing the submarine's advantage of stealth. On the strategic level, Allied shipyards were now producing merchant vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. American shipyards alone were launching 3 Liberty ships a day, outpacing losses by a wide margin. The arithmetic of attrition was becoming clear. The Allies could replace their losses, while Germany could not replace experienced submarine crews. It was against this backdrop that convoy SC-118 sailed from Sydney, Nova Scotia, on February 3, 1943, bound for Liverpool with 61 merchant ships carrying vital war supplies. And it was this convoy that Lieutenant Commander Osterman's U-624 was ordered to locate and report on, setting in motion the fatal encounter that would demonstrate how dramatically the technological balance had shifted. The crisp morning air of February 6, 1943, carried the scent of diesel and salt as Pilot Officer George Robertson climbed into the cockpit of his Boeing B-17 Fortress Mark 7A. The aircraft, designated as FL-459 by the Royal Air Force, sat heavily on the wind-swept airfield at Ballykelly, Northern Ireland, loaded with 7 depth charges in its bomb bay. Robertson, a 26-year-old former bank clerk from Edinburgh, adjusted his oxygen mask and ran through the pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. His crew of 7 had been flying together for 4 months, developing the seamless coordination essential for successful anti-submarine operations. His navigator, Flight Sergeant Harold Wells, laid out the charts showing their patrol sector over convoy SC-118, currently steaming eastward across the Atlantic, approximately 580 miles west of Northern Ireland. "Weather reports not good," Wells commented, tracing the projected convoy route. "Low clouds, occasional showers, perfect conditions for U-boats to surface and approach unseen," Robertson nodded. "And perfect for us to catch them by surprise if we stay above the cloud layer." Or the Fortress's 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared to life one after another, vibrating through the airframe as Robertson completed his final checks. Taking off at 0700 hours, they climbed through a layer of stratus clouds into the brilliant sunlight above. For the next 11 hours, they would patrol a designated sector above the convoy, their Mark III ASV radar scanning the ocean's surface for the distinctive return signal of a surfaced submarine. The grueling routine of convoy protection demanded intense concentration. Hours of monotony could be shattered in seconds by a radar contact or visual sighting. Each crew member knew their role precisely. The radar operator, constantly monitoring the scope, the gunners scanning different sectors of sky and sea, the wireless operator listening for updates from headquarters or distress calls from the convoy below. By late afternoon, with fuel reserves dwindling, Robertson was about to order a return to base when the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom. "Contact bearing 270, range 4 miles. The adrenaline surge was immediate. Robertson banked the aircraft gently, positioning for an approach that would place the setting sun behind them, blinding anyone looking up from the ocean surface. Descending cautiously through breaks in the cloud cover, the crew strained for visual confirmation. Then the bombardier spotted it, the dark cigar-shaped silhouette of a U-boat, knifing through the waves on the surface, seemingly unaware of their presence. "U-boat confirmed, preparing attack run," Robertson reported calmly into his microphone, his Scottish accent more pronounced under stress. The submarine, which they would later identify as U-624, appeared to be charging its batteries while transmitting, a dangerous but necessary combination of activities. The radio mast was clearly visible, extending upward from the conning tower. Robertson eased the bomber into a shallow dive, calculating wind drift and the submarine's speed. The aircraft's shadow would reach the U-boat seconds before they were overhead, giving the German crew minimal warning time. They had practiced this approach countless times, but each attack run brought unique challenges. At the same time, thousands of feet below, the wireless operator aboard U-624 was nearing the end of his transmission to Berlin. The message contained crucial information about the convoy's zigzag pattern, its estimated speed, and the disposition of escort vessels. This intelligence would allow headquarters to vector other U-boats in the area for a coordinated night attack, the Wolfpack tactic that had proven devastatingly effective. The harsh reality of submarine warfare was that communication was both essential and hazardous. Each transmission, no matter how brief, risked detection by Allied direction-finding equipment. U-boat commanders were trained to keep messages short and to dive immediately afterward, but Osterman had decided to extend this transmission to include detailed observations about a new radar-equipped destroyer he had observed the previous night. This information might save other U-boats from detection, but the extended transmission time left his own vessel vulnerable. As the Fortress bomber completed its attack approach, the lookout aboard U-624 finally spotted the aircraft's shadow on the water. The alarm was immediate, but too late. The submarine began its crash dive procedure, but Robertson's aircraft was already in position, the bomb bay doors open, depth charges primed. "Bombs away," called the bombardier as 7 cylindrical depth charges fell towards the ocean surface. Osterman's desperate maneuver came seconds too late. 2 depth charges straddled the U-boat perfectly as it began its dive, the massive underwater explosions lifting the vessel bodily from the sea before it disappeared beneath a churning column of white water. The Fortress circled the attack site, observing a spreading oil slick that confirmed a successful strike. All 45 crew members aboard U-624 were lost, their vessel joining the growing list of U-boats that would never return to their bases in France. What made this particular engagement significant was not just the skill of Robertson's crew, but what Allied intelligence would learn from it. The partial message intercepted from U-624 would provide valuable insights into German communication protocols, and more importantly, confirm that their detection methods were working exactly as designed. The tactical chess match between submarine and aircraft had taken another turn, with the advantage now shifting decisively to the hunters in the sky. As daylight faded over the Bay of Biscay on February 8, 1943, Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein paced the bridge of U-156, anxiously checking his watch. He should have received confirmation by now that U-624 had successfully joined the Wolfpack assembling around convoy SC-118. The radio silence was concerning. Hartenstein had been at sea for 23 days on his 7th war patrol. An experienced commander with 14 merchant vessels and the British troopship Laconia to his credit, he had developed an almost supernatural sense for danger. Something felt wrong tonight. "Anything from U-624?" he called down to his radio operator. "Nothing, Herr Kaleu," came the reply, using the familiar contraction of his rank. "Berlin has requested position confirmation 3 times without response." Hartenstein frowned. Ostermann was one of the most reliable commanders in the flotilla, not someone who would ignore direct requests from headquarters. Either his radio was damaged or something worse had happened. The same scene was playing out across multiple U-boats converging on the convoy. Each commander knew that the loss of a shadowing boat meant entering the hunt blind, without the crucial updates on convoy position and escort deployment that made coordinated attacks possible. At U-boat headquarters in Berlin, the atmosphere was equally tense. Admiral Dönitz had staked much on this particular convoy operation. Intelligence suggested it carried Sherman tanks, aircraft components, and raw materials vital to Britain's war production. After the costly failures of January, he needed a victory to justify his strategic approach to Hitler. As reports accumulated of U-boats failing to make scheduled contact, staff officers began plotting possible intercept courses based on the convoy's last known position, but without continuous updates, they were essentially guessing. The Wolfpack tactic, so devastatingly effective when communication flowed freely, began to break down without it. What none of them yet realized was that the battle had fundamentally changed. The Royal Air Force had deployed a new version of ASV radar that operated on a wavelength the German Metox detector couldn't sense. U-boats were being spotted and attacked before they had any warning of approaching aircraft. Furthermore, Allied cryptographers had made significant breakthroughs in reading naval Enigma transmissions. Many of the orders being sent from Berlin to the hunting U-boats were being decoded at Bletchley Park within hours, allowing Allied forces to reroute convoys away from danger or reinforce them with additional escort vessels and air patrols. The next morning, as Hartenstein finally located the convoy through his periscope, he was surprised to find it heavily protected by destroyers executing precise anti-submarine patterns. More alarming were the aircraft circling overhead, not just the expected short-range escorts from escort carriers, but long-range bombers that shouldn't have been able to reach this far into the Atlantic. After watching for several hours, he composed a terse message to Berlin. Convoy heavily guarded, air coverage continuous. Request new instructions. See you. The transmission lasted just under 20 seconds using the abbreviated Kurzsignale code to minimize detection risk. What Hartenstein didn't know was that this brief transmission was detected by 3 separate high-frequency direction-finding stations along the British coast. Within minutes, RAF Coastal Command Headquarters had plotted his probable position and diverted another patrolling Fortress bomber to investigate. 2 hours later, as Hartenstein prepared for a daring daylight torpedo attack, he was forced to crash dive when lookouts spotted an aircraft approaching. The depth charges that followed damaged his hydroplanes, forcing him to abort the mission and limp back toward the French coast for repairs. The pattern repeated across the hunting group. Of the 11 U-boats directed toward convoy SC-118, only 3 managed to attack, sinking just 2 merchant ships while losing 4 of their own to air and surface attacks. It was a devastating exchange rate that could not be sustained. In his headquarters, Admiral Dönitz faced the uncomfortable truth that Allied air power, particularly the long-range aircraft of RAF Coastal Command, had fundamentally altered the equation in the Atlantic. The tactic of using radio communications to coordinate wolf packs, which had been so effective in 1940 and 1941, now exposed his U-boats to unacceptable risk. On February 24th, after reviewing the mounting losses, Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, effectively conceding defeat in that critical sector. It was an admission that the technological balance had shifted and that new tactics would be needed if the U-boat campaign was to continue. For the crews of RAF Coastal Command, the victory was bittersweet. Their effectiveness had been proven, but at the cost of many merchant seamen and U-boat crew members who had perished in the frigid Atlantic waters. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for 2 more years, but February 1943 marked the turning point when the hunters became the hunted. Squadron leader James Patrick squinted at the operational map in the briefing room at RAF Ballykelly, tracing the projected course of convoy HX-224 with his finger. Red pins marked recent U-boat sightings, forming an ominous pattern around the convoy's path. As commander of B Flight in 220 Squadron, he had led crews on anti-submarine patrols for 18 months, watching as tactics evolved on both sides of this deadly chess game. "They're adapting," he told the assembled air crews. "Latest intelligence suggests they're shortening transmission times even further and changing frequencies more frequently. But they still need to surface to send and receive orders. That's our opportunity." Patrick's squadron had been at the forefront of implementing new technologies and techniques. The ASV Mark III centimetric radar had proven particularly effective, as it operated on a wavelength the German METOX detector couldn't pick up. This often allowed Coastal Command aircraft to approach within attack range before the U-boat crew realized they were in danger. "Remember," he continued, "these U-boats are coordinating with Berlin for a reason. They're reporting convoy positions and receiving attack instructions. Every transmission they make is a moment of vulnerability we can exploit." The crews nodded in understanding. After months of operations, they had developed an almost instinctive feel for where and when U-boats might surface to transmit. The predictable patterns, surfacing at dusk to report convoy sightings, or just after midnight to receive updated orders, created opportunities for ambush. The Royal Air Force had also benefited enormously from intelligence provided by Bletchley Park's codebreakers. Though this information was compartmentalized for security reasons, it filtered down in the form of patrol assignments that seemed to place aircraft in exactly the right place at the right time, much to the frustration of U-boat commanders who increasingly felt that nowhere was safe. As the February operations continued, Coastal Command implemented another innovation, coordinated coverage that ensured no gap in surveillance over convoys. Aircraft would time their patrols to overlap, preventing the periods of vulnerability that U-boats had previously exploited during shift changes. The human cost of this technological cat-and-mouse game was immense on both sides. Air crews routinely flew missions lasting 10 to 12 hours, fighting fatigue, extreme cold at high altitudes, and the constant strain of scanning endless ocean for the brief glimpse of a submarine. U-boat crews faced even harsher conditions, spending weeks in cramped, damp quarters with minimal sleep, constantly alert for the sound of approaching aircraft or ships. By mid-February, the new tactics were showing results. The February offensive saw Coastal Command aircraft sink 7 U-boats, the highest monthly total to that point in the war. 2 of these were credited to squadron leader Patrick's flight, including a dramatic attack on February 9th that caught U-614 on the surface while charging batteries. After dropping 7 depth charges that visibly damaged the submarine, Patrick circled back to observe the results. The submarine had survived the initial attack, but was clearly struggling, unable to maintain proper trim as it attempted to escape. Patrick radioed the position to nearby surface vessels, which arrived 6 hours later to find the damaged U-boat still trying to limp back to port. HMS Vimy finished the job with a precise depth charge attack, forcing the submarine to surface where the crew surrendered. The capture of U-614 provided valuable intelligence, including updated code books and technical information about modifications to the submarine's radio equipment. This intelligence further enhanced Allied ability to predict when and where U-boats would need to surface for communications. At the same time, in bases along the French coast, U-boat commanders were facing increasingly difficult decisions about when and how to communicate with headquarters. The traditional practice of surfacing at night to send situation reports now carried substantial risk, but operating without direction from Berlin left them tactically blind. Some captains began experimenting with extremely short transmissions sent from periscope depth, with only the radio mast exposed, but this compromised transmission quality and range. Others tried to time their communications with storms or heavy cloud cover, hoping to minimize the risk of aerial detection, but this made scheduling coordinated attacks nearly impossible. The February actions demonstrated a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The long-established German tactic of using radio communications to coordinate Wolfpack attacks had become a critical vulnerability, exploited with increasing effectiveness by Allied air power. Admiral Dönitz would be forced to reevaluate his entire approach to the Atlantic campaign, while RAF Coastal Command continued to refine the techniques that had proven so devastatingly effective. The human stories behind these technological changes revealed both tragedy and heroism. Logs recovered from sunken U-boats showed commanders struggling with impossible choices. Maintaining radio silence meant operating in isolation without support, while transmitting necessary information exposed their vessels to detection and attack. It was a dilemma with no good solution, a direct result of Allied technological superiority in the critical domain of detection and communication. The clash of submarine and aircraft over the Atlantic in February 1943 represented a turning point, not just in tactical terms, but in the fundamental nature of naval warfare. The traditional advantages of the submarine, stealth and surprise, were being systematically neutralized by advances in radar, direction finding, and coordination between air and surface forces. The morning of February 21, 1943, dawned gray and misty over RAF Aldergrove in Northern Ireland. Pilot Officer Victor Milligan performed his pre-flight checks on Liberator T of 120 Squadron with particular care. Intelligence reports indicated that convoy on 166, which they would be protecting, faced an imminent threat from a gathering wolf pack. Milligan's Liberator was equipped with the latest ASV Mark III radar, capable of detecting surfaced submarines through cloud cover and darkness. The enormous four-engined bomber, with its distinctive twin-tail assembly, carried enough fuel for a 12-hour patrol and 8 depth charges in its bomb bay. "Weather's in our favor today," observed Flight Lieutenant Warren, the squadron intelligence officer, as he delivered the final briefing on the tarmac. "Low cloud ceiling will force the U-boats to come up higher to get decent radio transmission to Berlin, makes them more visible to radar." Milligan nodded, understanding the implications. U-boat commanders faced a difficult choice in such conditions: either stay at periscope depth with poor radio performance, or surface fully to transmit clearly, exposing themselves to detection. At 0600 hours, the Liberator thundered down the runway and climbed steadily through the overcast sky. Their patrol sector was in the mid-Atlantic, almost equidistant between Ireland and Nova Scotia, the heart of what sailors called the Black Pit, and where aircraft coverage had previously been impossible due to range limitations. The modified Liberators had changed that equation, extending air cover across the entire Atlantic. As Milligan's navigator directed them toward the convoy's reported position, the radar operator maintained a constant watch on the scope, searching for the telltale return signal of a submarine's conning tower breaking the surface. 3 hours into the patrol, as the aircraft circled the eastern flank of the widely dispersed convoy, the radio operator intercepted a fragmentary transmission in the frequency band used by U-boats. Though the encrypted message couldn't be decoded in flight, its source could be approximately located through direction finding. Signal bearing 210, "Strength increasing," reported the radio operator. "They're close and transmitting continuously." Milligan immediately banked the Liberator toward the bearing, dropping to 2,000 feet below the cloud layer for better visibility. The radar operator confirmed a contact just moments later, a surfaced submarine moving at high speed, likely rushing to join the forming wolf pack. What they had detected was U-623, commanded by Oberleutnant Hermann Schubert. Having only recently arrived in the operational area after crossing the Atlantic, Schubert was transmitting his position and fuel state to Berlin while requesting attack coordinates for the convoy. Standard procedure called for brief, encoded transmissions, but Schubert had extended his communication to include detailed observations about the convoy's escort patterns, valuable intelligence for the waiting wolf pack. This decision to extend the transmission proved fatal. As the Liberator emerged from a cloud bank, the lookout aboard U-623 spotted the approaching aircraft and sounded the alarm. Schubert ordered an immediate crash dive, but the submarine had been caught too far from its diving position, with crew members on the bridge and the radio mast extended. Milligan's attack run was textbook perfect. The Liberator swept in at masthead height, dropping its depth charges in a precise pattern that straddled the diving submarine. The massive underwater explosions threw columns of water hundreds of feet into the air, and when they subsided, debris and an expanding oil slick marked the submarine's grave. All 46 crew members aboard U-623 were lost, adding to the mounting toll of experienced submariners that Germany could ill afford to lose. What made this engagement particularly significant was that subsequent intelligence analysis revealed U-623 had been coordinating the gathering wolf pack, acting as a communications relay between Berlin and the other submarines converging on convoy on 166. With this command node eliminated, the planned coordinated attack faltered. The remaining U-boats, uncertain of the convoy's exact position and lacking updated instructions, were forced to hunt individually, greatly reducing their effectiveness. The convoy reached Liverpool 6 days later, having lost only one merchant vessel despite the presence of 9 U-boats in the patrol area. This pattern repeated across the Atlantic throughout late February and March, as Coastal Command aircraft systematically targeted U-boats caught in the act of communication. The technological balance had shifted decisively in favor of the hunters in the sky. Admiral Dönitz, analyzing the mounting losses, recognized the critical vulnerability his communication requirements had created. In a March 3, 1943, directive to all operational U-boats, he ordered, "Extreme caution must be exercised when transmitting, surface only when absolutely necessary for communication, and dive immediately afterward. Keep all transmissions under 20 seconds when possible." But this restriction created its own problems. Without regular communication with headquarters and other submarines, the coordinated Wolfpack tactics became nearly impossible to execute effectively. Individual U-boats were forced to operate more independently, reducing their collective impact on Allied shipping. The crews of Coastal Command, for their part, continued to refine their hunting techniques. They analyzed patterns of U-boat communications, identifying preferred times and locations for transmission. They developed overlapping patrol patterns that made it increasingly difficult for submarines to find safe windows for surfacing, and they integrated intelligence from code-breaking operations to place aircraft in the most likely areas for successful intercepts. By the end of March 1943, the transformation was complete. What had once been the hunters' greatest advantage, their ability to coordinate through radio communication, had become their greatest vulnerability. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point, not through a single dramatic engagement, but through the accumulated effect of technological superiority systematically applied. The human cost was staggering. Of the 40,000 German sailors who served in the U-boat fleet during the war, nearly 30,000 would never return. Many perished in the exact scenario that had claimed U-623, caught on the surface, vulnerable to attack from the air, in the brief moments when communication with headquarters was necessary. The ultimate irony was that the very system designed to make the Wolfpacks more effective, centralized command and control through radio communication, had created the vulnerability that led to their defeat. In attempting to coordinate his submarine fleet with precision from Berlin, Admiral Dönitz had inadvertently provided Allied forces with the means to detect and destroy his boats when they were most vulnerable. Helmut Krauss stood on the observation deck of the submarine bunker at Lorient, France, watching as a damaged Type 7C U-boat limped into port. The massive concrete structure, built to withstand the heaviest Allied bombing, echoed with the sounds of repair crews and machinery. As Chief Communications Officer for the 3rd U-boat Flotilla, Krauss had watched with growing alarm as fewer submarines returned from each patrol. "Another one back without torpedoes fired," remarked Karl Dönitz, Jr., a junior signals officer standing beside him. "Third this week." Krauss nodded grimly. They never even reached their patrol areas. The British have aircraft everywhere now. The technological race that had defined the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new phase. By April 1943, RAF Coastal Command operated over 700 aircraft dedicated to anti-submarine warfare. Their centimetric radar was now complemented by advanced direction-finding equipment that could locate U-boat transmissions with unprecedented accuracy. The German response had been multi-pronged but increasingly desperate. Engineers had developed the Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, reducing the need to surface fully. But this was only a partial solution. The snorkel itself could be detected by radar, and it severely limited the submarine's speed and maneuverability. More advanced radio equipment allowed for faster transmission of messages, but even the briefest communication risked detection. Some U-boats were being retrofitted with increased anti-aircraft armament, including quadruple 20mm cannon mounts in an attempt to fight off attacking aircraft rather than diving to escape them. Most promising was the courier system, which could transmit a complete message in less than half a second. Too brief for Allied direction-finding equipment to get an accurate fix. But this technology was still in development and would not be widely deployed before the war's end. Meanwhile, in London, Air Vice Marshal George Brooks of Coastal Command reviewed the February and March operations reports with satisfaction. The numbers were compelling: 28 U-boats sunk by aircraft in those 2 months alone, compared to just 48 for the entirety of 1942. "The tide has turned," he told his staff officers. "We're no longer just defending convoys. We're actively hunting U-boats throughout their transit routes." The Bay of Biscay, once a relatively safe passage for submarines traveling between their French bases and the Atlantic hunting grounds, had become a killing zone. Round-the-clock air patrols meant that U-boats were forced to transit submerged, dramatically reducing their speed and range. Intelligence from captured submariners revealed the psychological impact of this reversal. Where once U-boat crews had considered themselves the elite of the German Navy, now they spoke of suicide missions and iron coffins. Morale was deteriorating rapidly as crews realized their chances of surviving a full tour of duty were diminishing with each patrol. The most significant change was in the fundamental assumptions of submarine warfare. Since the First World War, the submarine's primary advantage had been its ability to disappear beneath the waves, becoming effectively invisible to surface vessels. But advanced radar, sonobuoys, and direction-finding equipment had dramatically reduced this advantage. A submarine now faced detection, whether surfaced or submerged, with the critical communication function creating a particularly vulnerable moment. By May 1943, the results were undeniable. Admiral Dönitz, now promoted to Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy following the resignation of Erich Raeder, was forced to temporarily withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes after losing 43 boats in that month alone. In his war diary, Dönitz wrote, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The enemy's air coverage has made operations against convoys impossible. Without losses, we cannot sustain." The human stories behind these statistics were equally compelling. Flight Lieutenant Michael Barstow of 227 Squadron described a typical engagement in his mission report from April 12, 1943. Detected U-boat by radar at 23:15 hours, range 4 miles. Visibility poor due to rain squalls. Made attack approach from up moon, catching the submarine fully surfaced with crew members, visible on the conning tower. They appeared to be in the process of radio communication as the transmission mast was extended. Attack resulted in 2 direct hits with depth charges. Submarine broke in half and sank within 40 seconds. No survivors observed despite remaining in area for 30 minutes. The speed with which we can now locate and attack these vessels when they surface to communicate has fundamentally altered the equation of this campaign. For the German submariners, the new reality was starkly different from the happy time of 1940 and 1941, when they had hunted Allied shipping with near impunity. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, one of the most successful U-boat commanders with 20 merchant ships and 2 warships to his credit, described the changed situation in a letter to his wife that was later found among his personal effects. "We can no longer operate as we once did. The moment we surfaced to send our reports to headquarters, the British aircraft seemed to appear as if by magic. We are hunted now in a way I would not have believed possible 2 years ago. The men know the odds and face them bravely, but I cannot help but wonder how many more patrols I will be fortunate enough to survive." Lehmann-Willenbrock would indeed survive the war, one of the fortunate minority of U-boat commanders to do so. But his experiences in 1943 represented the painful transition from hunter to hunted that characterized the latter stages of the Battle of the Atlantic. The fundamental irony was that the very system that had made the Wolfpack so effective, centralized command and control through radio communication, had become their greatest vulnerability. The technological race had tipped decisively in favor of the Allies, and the U-boat, once the terror of the Atlantic, had become prey for the aircraft of coastal command. The legacy of this transformation would extend far beyond the war itself. The lessons learned about the integration of air power, radio direction finding, and coordinated anti-submarine tactics would shape naval doctrine for decades to come. The modern concept of maritime patrol aircraft as the primary counter to submarine threats traces its lineage directly to the innovations of RAF Coastal Command in those critical months of 1943. As summer 1943 faded into autumn, the Battle of the Atlantic continued, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The crucial supply lines between North America and Britain remained open, ensuring that the buildup for the eventual invasion of Europe could proceed. The U-boat fleet, while still dangerous, had lost its ability to threaten Allied victory. For the crews of both sides who had fought this bitter struggle far from public view, the battle's significance was clear. Without control of the Atlantic shipping lanes, Britain could not have continued the fight against Nazi Germany. The victory had been won not through a single decisive battle, but through thousands of individual engagements, like that of U-624, caught in the vulnerable moment of communication, illuminated by the harsh glare of technology that had stripped away the submarine's traditional advantages. On a cold November morning in 1945, 6 months after Germany's surrender, a small group gathered at RAF Coastal Command headquarters near London. They had assembled to witness the presentation of a detailed report on the Battle of the Atlantic, compiled from both Allied and captured German records. The report's conclusions were stark. Of the 739 U-boats lost during the war, 290 were sunk by aircraft, with RAF Coastal Command accounting for 190 of these. More telling was the analysis of exactly when and how these submarines had been detected. Nearly 60% had been caught while surfaced for communication purposes. Air Vice Marshal Alec Corriton, who had commanded Coastal Command during the final year of the war, addressed the assembled officers, "Gentlemen, the lesson is clear. What began as a battle of ship against submarine evolved into something entirely different, a battle of communication against detection. The critical vulnerability we exploited was not the U-boat itself, but its need to communicate." A former U-boat commander, now assisting Allied intelligence, added his perspective. Admiral Donitz's strategy required centralized control. Each boat needed to report sightings and receive attack coordinates. Without this communication, the Wolfpack tactic was impossible. But each transmission became a beacon for your aircraft. It was a dilemma without solution. The technological race had driven both sides to remarkable innovations. By war's end, the Germans had developed the Schnorkel, which reduced but did not eliminate the need to surface fully. They had created faster transmission systems like Courier, which could send a complete message in milliseconds rather than seconds. They had added substantial anti-aircraft armament to their submarines in a desperate attempt to fight rather than flee when caught on the surface. But the Allies had kept pace and maintained their advantage. More sensitive radar could detect even the small profile of a Schnorchel mast. Advanced direction-finding equipment could triangulate the source of even the briefest transmission, and long-range aircraft ensured that no area of the Atlantic remained beyond the reach of air patrols. The human cost of this technological battle had been enormous. Of approximately 40,000 German submariners who served during the war, nearly 30,000 never returned, a casualty rate of 75%, higher than any other branch of any military service in the war. For the air crews of Coastal Command, the toll had also been heavy. Over 5,800 personnel had been killed while hunting submarines, often in terrible weather conditions far from land. Many aircraft simply disappeared without trace, running out of fuel after becoming disoriented over the featureless ocean. As the winter sun cast long shadows across the airfield, a veteran pilot from 220 Squadron reflected on the significance of what they had accomplished. When we began this fight, the advantage was all with the submarine. They could see us coming while we searched blindly. By the end, we could find them in darkness, through cloud cover, even when they thought themselves safe. But the real victory wasn't technological. It was in understanding their fundamental vulnerability and exploiting it relentlessly. The Battle of the Atlantic had demonstrated a truth that would define naval warfare in the modern age. Communication is both essential and dangerous. The need to coordinate forces creates vulnerabilities that an adaptive enemy will exploit. This lesson would shape military doctrine through the Cold War and beyond, influencing everything from submarine design to communications protocols. For the public, the dramatic surface battles and bombing campaigns of the war often overshadowed the grinding struggle in the Atlantic. Few civilians understood how close Britain had come to defeat in 1941 and early 1942, when U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. Even fewer appreciated the technological revolution that had turned the tide, how advances in radar, direction finding, and aircraft range had systematically stripped away the submarine's traditional advantages. But for those who had fought in this battle of detection and evasion, the transformation was undeniable. In the decades that followed, submarines would evolve to address the vulnerabilities exposed during the Battle of the Atlantic. Nuclear propulsion would eliminate the need to surface for battery charging. Advanced communication systems would reduce the risk of detection during transmission. But the fundamental challenge would remain how to balance the operational requirement for communication with the tactical need for stealth, for The legacy of those February 1943 engagements, when aircraft caught U-boats in the vulnerable moment of surface communication, would echo through naval history. The battle had revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technology can rapidly and decisively shift the balance between predator and prey, between hunter and hunted, and in that shift lies the difference between victory and defeat. Would you have made the same choice as Lieutenant Commander Osterman of U-624, remaining on the surface to complete your transmission despite the growing danger of aircraft detection? Or would you have dived immediately, preserving your vessel but failing to deliver the intelligence that might have saved other submarines in your group? These impossible decisions faced by commanders on both sides reveal the human dimension of technological warfare. How strategic necessities create tactical vulnerabilities that individual sailors and airmen must navigate with their lives at stake. The Battle of the Atlantic ultimately turned on thousands of such individual choices, as commanders balanced competing priorities in an environment where the technological parameters were constantly shifting. The victory belonged not just to better equipment, but to the men who understood how to exploit the enemy's fundamental vulnerabilities, creating a systematic advantage that over time proved decisive. As we reflect on this critical chapter of naval warfare history, remember the lesson it teaches. In the eternal contest between communication and stealth, between detection and evasion, advantage is never permanent. Technology changes the equation, but human decisions determine the outcome. The U-boat surfaced to signal Berlin, and Coastal Command aircraft were waiting above them, a moment of vulnerability exploited with devastating effect, changing the course of the most crucial supply battle of the Second World War. Share this story so others remember what these men on both sides faced and how their courage, innovation, and sacrifice shaped the world we inherited from their struggle.